What is up, everybody? It's everybody's favorite week, the week where Nintendo is going to be reporting their financials, and they're going to be doing so on Friday. As a bit of an interesting tidbit, this will be the first time that they ever share their annual earnings on a Friday. And I think it's kind of obvious they've chosen to do that because they are afraid of what the investors are going to see. Remember, Nintendo does not operate to please you or me or any other Nintendo fan out there. They are beholden to, above everyone else, the shareholders, not the fans. So even when they show that they reached 20 million units sold in the first 10 months of the Switch 2's life, similar to what happened back in February, when the investors once again see that the patterns are trending significantly more in favor of the Japanese market, which is not good because the Switch 2 in Japan is a lot cheaper than what's being sold in the West, the investors are once again going to be very disappointed about the impacts that's going to have on their profits. And as such, Takashi Mochuzuki of Bloomberg suggests that Nintendo should either raise the Switch 2 price or stop selling the Japanese exclusive model. Now, obviously, some people are a little bit confused as to why the Japanese exclusive model is a detriment, because as we all know, the big defense around the Switch 2 having a cheaper price in Japan all along has been that, well, if you account for the weaker yen, the Japanese actually do not have a cheaper Switch 2. But at the end of the day, the Switch 2 in the Western markets is subsidizing the price of the Japanese one. And with the Japanese model selling so proportionally well in comparison to the Western markets, significantly more than what we've seen in previous generations, to put it simply, not enough units have been sold in Western markets to make up for the price deficit that has occurred on the Japanese models. Or so that was the case through last February, and presumably by this Friday it should be a similar situation. Most estimates, and these are not my own estimates, expect that the Nintendo Switch 2 will have sold over 3 million units over this last quarter, with anywhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of that being entirely from Japan, where, once again, the console is being sold for around $320. So from an investor's angle, that's about $130 that's lost for every Japanese console that's sold that needs to be made up by Western markets. Which, depending on margins, which is not really made public to us, means you probably need to sell around 4 or 5 consoles for every one that's sold in Japan everywhere else to make up for the deficit in the price of the Japanese model. But in the quarter that ended on December 31st, there were only 2 consoles being sold elsewhere with every one that was sold in Japan. And it's trending in a way to seem like that's very likely to be repeated. Now, you'll hear a lot of news about how Takashi Mochuzuki is nothing but a liar, and that works from Bloomberg. And I won't really delve too deep into that because, well, that's been discussed before in depth, and I don't think anybody's going to change their mind for or against it. But to keep the topic more focused on this article specifically, he hasn't really said anything incorrect, nor has he given any true breaking news. His article simply suggests that shares are in the worst streak they have been in a decade, which signals the investors' displeasure. Now, again, this doesn't mean that Nintendo is a success or a failure. That's not what I'm trying to argue here. But it's unquestionable that when more investors are putting in money and the stock price goes up, that the investors are more pleased, and they have more confidence in the company. Don't take my word for it, take Stealth's word for it from last year. All-time high, investor confidence had never been higher. Which, again, by using that very logic of this very devout Nintendo fanboy themselves, now that this share has had the worst streak in about a decade, investors are clearly losing confidence in Nintendo and the Switch 2. He goes on in the article and says that since the launch of its Switch 2 in June, Nintendo has been on a hot streak of successful game releases. Obviously, he's talking about the Pokemon titles. And it's punctuated with park attractions and another winning cinema release last month. These are all things we agree on, right? Games have sold very well, specifically the Pokemon ones, and now Tamagotchi Life has had a good launch as well. Makes sense because it's a Switch 1 title. And again, keep in mind, as every one of these things released, the stock did jump up slightly for a few days, and many Nintendo fans rallied behind the idea that the game was doing so well, so it was giving confidence for Nintendo to go on another run and their stock value will rise. I'm simply, once again, using Nintendo fan logic here about the stock value mattering only when it's going up and not when it's going down, apparently. But yeah, it should be riding high, yet its Tokyo traded shares are on their worst run in a decade. And the problem is in the investor circles. The price of the Nintendo Switch 2 console itself. Based off of Mochizuki's words, many now believe that Nintendo simply must raise prices when it reports its earnings this Friday to guard against escalating costs and appease an anxious investor community. Again, he still hasn't said anything wrong. This has been a talking point basically since the console launched, that many people do believe indeed that the Nintendo Switch 2 should have a price hike like everything else in tech right now. Now, he also states that others worry about the impact on demand, though that may be short-lived, unlike the share price pressure. So again, the idea is that if the console goes up in price, that could decrease the demand of people that are willing to go out and buy a Nintendo Switch 2. But at least Mochizuki's opinion is that that will be short-lived. All Nintendo needs to do is launch another Pokemon game, and obviously everybody will flood to the stores. He goes on to once again share a truth. This is not something that he's making up. Nintendo's stock has retreated for 5 straight months, marking the longest sustained decline since 2016. And remember, what came out in 2017 was the Switch 1, where Nintendo went on its amazing run, back when fan sentiment had never been higher during that entire console generation and completely crapped the bed last year. Happy fans meant happy investors, meant happy Nintendo, meant a lot of money for everybody. It's not quite the same since the launch of the Switch 2. And basically, as soon as it hits that all-time high in August, and then we get September through the end of the year with everything that's going on around the world, between people being upset with Nintendo and the way they operate, leading to one of the worst holiday seasons Nintendo has seen in the last decade, in addition to the issues we've had with tariffs, we've had with memory, and now you got the war going on overseas. All of that adds up to now you're at a value that's pretty much half of what you were back in August. Mochizuki goes on to talk about how Nintendo has had hit after hit after hit between the Pokepia game and the Mario Galaxy movie, suggesting that Nintendo is on an enviable run of success. In fact, even data from Circana and Famitsu suggests that the Switch 2 continues to sell faster than any other home games console machine in history. See, now they have to start saying home consoles now because everybody knows that the GBA has surpassed the Switch 2, at least in the Western markets. So then why, oh why, has Nintendo sunk so much lower than Sony? And the assumption here by Mochizuki is that investors are concerned that the $450 Switch 2 is deeply unprofitable. And again, there's nothing that he's saying here that's new or untrustworthy. This is a discussion that has been surfaced and really amplified ever since the start of the war this year. Now, in my opinion, at one point in time, more so like a year ago from now, I do think there was a lot of wiggle room for Nintendo to drop the price of the Switch 2. And even through the start of this year, I was leaning towards that same idea. While the profit margins had decreased a bit, I didn't think there was still any room where Nintendo might have pressure. Now, basically since April, I'm not sure anymore. Once war is involved, it gets a little bit unpredictable. One thing is for certain, however, is that even though sometimes hardware can be sold at a loss or it can be sold with less profit, you need software sales to make up for those numbers. And clearly through the first year of the Switch 2's life, the software sales haven't made up the deficit that Nintendo investors are seeing. Even if some games have been breaking records, other games have been major disappointments. And again, this is my opinion, but I think this is a very big reason why investors feel like that hardware price should go up. Because at least as it stands, one thing is for certain, the Switch 2 hardware is moving. Even if it's moving in a much more favorable proportion to where it's being sold for $130 less than in Western markets. Now, all eyes turn to Friday's earnings briefing to see if Nintendo President Shuntaro Furukawa addresses the Switch 2's pricing strategy. Hideki Yasuda, an analyst at Toyo Research Advice, believes that the stock will continue to struggle until the price is adjusted. Yasuda suggests that the market is punishing stocks that lack inflation hedging power. And again, to kind of retread something that was stated a little bit earlier in this video, but the predicament is that the shares might also dip, at least briefly, if Nintendo does raise prices, as some investors would fear such a move that could dampen the hardware demand. Again, the price goes up, fewer people will want to buy the console. And this is exactly what the analyst Michael Pachter is saying, that the consumer is hurting. People are paying more for gasoline and food, and when prices go up, entertainment budgets are one of the first things to go. We've talked about this, I've talked about this, I'm sure many others have as well, since the very beginning, almost a year ago now. The Switch 2 is a luxury item. It's being priced higher than anybody ever expected a Nintendo console would go. And outside of all of the enthusiasts and the Pokemon fans that decided to pick it up in this first year, we saw a major stumble during the holiday season. This is a very big reason why. It's not a coincidence that the console is moving much better in Japan, where it was more competitively priced. And the article actually continues, and it reiterates something that I stated a few minutes ago. The choice is stark. If you permit the shares to continue their decline by holding the Switch 2 price firm, and hoping for a major software hit to change the narrative, basically doing what most console manufacturers have historically done, sell the console at a loss and hope that you make it up with software sales, then you do not have to risk alienating your customers. Obviously, the very big issue behind that is twofold. Nintendo hasn't exactly had the best lineup since the console launched, and that's a large reason why the software sales have struggled, but it's also because the games have been too expensive. Nintendo trying to set that $70 and $80 price tag as the new benchmark. Now, the funny thing is, these analysts, they suggest that a price increase of $50 to $100 more appears most plausible, but Toyo Yasuda actually suggests that such an adjustment might only make the Switch 2 less of a burden rather than truly profitable. And again, the only people that actually know what's profitable and how much money they're making on every Switch console is Nintendo. These analysts don't actually know that. But naturally, with everything that's gone on in the last year, and especially because of how much more expensive moving things around now is because of the war specifically, we may not have concrete evidence that the console is being sold at a loss, but if it isn't, it's probably getting close to it. But either way, as we mentioned before, it's not uncommon for console carriers to sell their product at a loss. The issue is that for Nintendo, specifically during the original Switch's life, a huge reason why it was such a breakthrough is because Nintendo avoided selling it at a loss. With the Switch, and with its success specifically, they effectively broke the industry habit of subsidizing hardware to recoup the costs through software. If you're wondering why Sony and Xbox do not sell their consoles at a loss anymore, it's because Nintendo set the framework for them. And obviously Nintendo was smart to do this because it was a defensive strategy developed after the Wii U's failure. And again, the article reiterates something I suggested earlier. Additionally, it must be noted that overall software sales for the Switch 2 remain tepid. So you're looking at going from the Switch 1 generation where the hardware was being sold at a profit, and the software sales were just one home run after the other, whereas now you're not only looking at a lower profit margin for the hardware, but the software is not moving enough to make up for that lower profit margin. And now this is probably the part of the article that has ruffled the most jammies online. The article suggests that one effective strategy could involve raising the US price by about $50, which I still think would have a detriment to an effect, unless they decided to like bundle an extra game with it or something. But in addition to raising the console by $50, they would also discontinue the Japanese only model, which only costs roughly $318 when you account for the conversion rate. Obviously, a very big reason this worries people is because Japan is kind of carrying Nintendo here. And a very big reason why it's carrying Nintendo to the extent that it is because of how fairly priced the console is there in comparison to other markets. And especially because of how fairly priced it is in comparison to the PlayStation consoles. Again, through the holiday quarter, which is the biggest quarter of the year, there were like 7 million consoles sold during that holiday season worldwide. So 1/3 of every console that was sold at a $130 discount, give or take. Obviously, when you account for the European prices and how those convert back to the US dollar and the yen, it's a little bit different. But regardless, one thing is for certain is that every Japanese model that's sold is a deficit for Nintendo. Either a deficit in profits or a straight up loss in what's being made, especially now in May of 2026. But the issue is that Nintendo has focused so much on success in Japan because of how much that helps their image worldwide when it comes to unit sales, both of the software and the hardware, as well as how much it helps with their relationship with third-party companies, and it trickles down to the fandom with how much they enjoy seeing those Famitsu reports every single week, that if you were to eliminate that discounted Nintendo Switch 2 console and only sell that international model for 70,000 yen, which converts to almost exactly $450, then you risk losing a massive advantage that you have in the Japanese market. But on the opposite side of things, if you raise the price of the Switch 2 in Western markets, you sell potentially even fewer units, and you might be selling even fewer units in Western markets to make up for the deficits that are occurring for the cheaper model that's being sold in Japan. It really is a predicament, and it's not one that I would like to be in. If I gave a crap about the feelings of a corporation, I might actually feel bad for Nintendo in this case. Now, in the last quarterly report, Nintendo had actually acknowledged that a price hike is a possibility and stated that it would evaluate the option against overall economic conditions. And that was like before an entire frickin' war starting. Every indication from the company, which as a reminder pretty much increased the price on everything but the price of the Switch 2, is that it would rather digest some hardship in the near term to ensure the platform flourishes over the long run, further highlighting that hiking too early into the Switch 2 cycle could cause a slowdown in the new software sales. Again, you need those software sales to make the big bucks, and that would be disastrous for margins. This was from another Japanese equity analyst, Pelham Smithers. If they make a mistake on the pricing, whichever way it goes, we run into the Wii U problem. Remember guys, I've never said that the Switch 2 would not be able to sell the Wii U. I notice that comes up a lot, that people think that that's what I was suggesting in the beginning. But in this current climate, what I have suggested is that the Switch 2 can be seen in the long term as a Wii U of 2026. There are other ways that parallels can be drawn that aren't simply hardware sales in comparison to the industry. And again, that's what Pelham Smithers is suggesting. If they make a mistake on the pricing, whichever way it goes, we run into the Wii U problem. The situation will just get worse and worse. And the article closes off by reminding us of something that we all already knew, effectively summarizing something that was already discussed pretty in depth on this channel through most of last year, after the Switch 2 was stockpiled, leading to it having a record-breaking launch last summer that caused Nintendo to commit to aggressive production targets for the holiday window. But the year-end shopping results did not meet expectations, forcing the company to ask manufacturing partners to reduce their output. That summer surge may have been fueled by consumers rushing to buy amid rumors of potential price hikes linked to US tariffs, which was a very big talking point last year. Basically, Nintendo needs to decide what their plan is, since leaving customers in suspense is unhelpful. Honestly, the only part of the article that I do think is a bit strange is the way that they close it off. If Nintendo seeks encouragement, it may find it in the PlayStation 5 example. PS5 and PS5 Pro sales regained their footing in Japan pretty soon following their price increase last month. See, what it sounds like he's saying is that he's implying that you can increase the prices and those increased prices will mean that you'll do better. But I think what he's actually suggesting is that even if you do increase the prices, there is still light at the end of the tunnel. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible to regain your footing beyond a price increase. The difference is that Sony already relies significantly less on the Japanese market than Nintendo does. And it's drifted away from the Japanese market over the course of the last console generation, basically. So the whiplash has already occurred for Sony, so these jumps in percentages of sales are not nearly as effective as they would be if you had the same types of jumps with Nintendo. Because in Nintendo's case, through most of the Switch's life, and especially since the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, the Japanese market has been at the forefront, basically their most important market when it comes to like a PR and worldwide standpoint. I do not think Nintendo can afford to mess around with the Japanese market. You would see a major drop-off in sales in Japan if you got rid of that cheaper model, and that could potentially ripple into a whole other set of issues for Nintendo. Now, obviously, you guys know my opinion on the matter. I think Nintendo has a very clear path to success, but it's the path that they're not going to take. And that's the path that we saw through the Switch 1 generation. I think they've been trying to tiptoe towards the idea of pushing more software sales by making digital sales look like they're cheaper than physical sales by charging a physical tax. Instead of simply tiptoeing around that, I think if they were to just drop down the software games prices to $60 and $50 and keep it that as the standard price instead of just a one-off price for whatever Splatoon's going to be as a spin-off, you could potentially see a dramatic influx in software sales, which would offset the loss that you're taking on the hardware. And I will even take it a step further. Again, we don't know for sure how much the Switch 2 is being sold at a loss, technically. We don't even know if it's being sold at a loss. But if you did drop the price of the Switch 2, you would have more units out there, and with more units out there that were affordable, more people will buy software, and with more software being sold, you make up those losses. And I'm not suggesting that's what they're going to do, but the reality is if they had decided to just stick with the strategy they had with the Switch 1, sell some cheaper hardware at a better, more affordable price, the lower hardware price would have led to more people buying the console, which ultimately would have led to more games being purchased by each person that bought a console because now they got more to spend, which again is the exact same thing we saw during the Switch 1's life. And they probably would not be facing as bad of financial struggles as they are right now. But I think Nintendo decided to chase the whales. They're looking for the type of person that would drop $70 on Pokepia in 1 month, and then immediately after that in the following month, drop an additional dollars on Tamagotchi Life. And I don't know how sustainable that's going to be in this market. You're looking at expensive hardware and expensive software. And all throughout that entire situation, there's discussions about price increases. So you've already had people flood towards the console to buy it out of fear of a price increase, effectively pulling forward some of your future sales. And the reality is, when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2, even if they are at 20 million sold right now, there is still a lot more room for growth. A lot more customers that have not adopted yet that otherwise would have bought a console already in the Nintendo world. Sony right now could set up shop and say that we're not going to sell any single PlayStation 5 for $1,000 for the rest of this console generation, and they would be fine because they have almost 100 million already out there in circulation. They can make plenty of money off the software. But unfortunately for Nintendo, they do not have that luxury when it comes to the Switch 2. I don't think they're in a comfortable enough position right now where they can increase the price and just sit tight and hope their software sales move everything forward. If they increase the price of the hardware, they would really need to decrease the price of the software, much more than just a simple $10 off for digital games, to increase the profits. And at the same time, I don't know if they can necessarily just keep doing everything as they've been moving along so far. If the investors weren't happy before, they're not going to be happy going forward. And obviously, the most important thing for Nintendo is happy investors. I'm genuinely intrigued to see what Nintendo's play is this upcoming Friday. One thing is for certain is that they're definitely going to have to do something to please their investors. They tried to kick things down the road in the last quarterlies. They might try to kick it down the road again, but at some point, something's got to give. Whether that's now or later, well, we'll find out this week. In any case, that's all I have for right now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.